Okay, we're going to get started. Thanks everyone for coming. It's my pleasure to announce our today's guest, Yugon Kim. He's a founding member, founding owner and partner of IKD. He's also an associate director of TSKP Architects in Boston. Prior to establishing his practice, he was with the Renzo Piano Building Workshop since 2006. In addition to his professional practice, Yugon serves as chair for the Boston Society of Architects Museum and Exhibition Design Committee, and he's the co-chair of the Harvard Asian Alumni Alliance in Boston. He's also is a faculty member at RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, and has taught design studios at Wentworth Institute of Technology in Northeastern. He holds degrees, a master's degree from Harvard and a bachelor's degree from Bard College. And I had the pleasure of getting to know Yugon through Exhibit Columbus, which hopefully we'll be talking about some of that.
Just a little.
So with that, welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It's when I was putting this presentation together, it made me realize how many stars and moons had to align for, I think, the project in Columbus to come into reality. And I guess for you guys to be interested, for me to come speak. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some projects that led up to the project in Columbus, which hopefully some of you have been to see. It's the kind of wood round thing that you saw there. So we'll walk through that, but really it's speaking about my journey in using timber as a kind of primary material of interest in constructing space. The reason of using timber has evolved over time. I think when you're a kid, you use wood because it's just there, it's accessible. You have wood blocks when you're a kid. When I got older, it was when I was a sculptor. I used wood because it was abundant and cheap. And then as I started practicing architecture, the reasons for using timber changed quite a bit. And so we'll talk a little bit about that journey. And so my background is in sculpture. I had never had an intention to be an architect at all. My father is an architect, which is probably the reason why I never wanted to be an architect. But I was always in love with making. And I started doing small-scale sculpture, then larger-scale installation, and eventually decided to go to architecture school to mostly enrich my sculptural interests. And so while I was at architecture school, I suddenly realized I didn't want to do sculpture anymore. And sculpture felt a little empty. It felt like a personal pursuit, and architecture could be a lot more. And I think this decision, and I was speaking earlier today about it with one of your classmates, it is something that I think allows me to look at architecture from a different perspective, because I think many architects today, they often would like to make sculpture, but at that critical juncture, I made a choice that I didn't want to do sculpture. I wanted to make architecture. And so really there was a journey of how do I meld my kind of interest in sculpture, but the depth of what I thought architecture could do, and find a way to marry those two together so that I could satisfy both aspirations. So about 5 years ago, my business partner and I, we established IKD. And I had just finished the large museum project. And so I was looking for a new platform to start a practice. And so what the BSA had, the Boston Society of Architects, had this open competition to curate and design an exhibition in their exhibition space. And so as many competitions go often, or submittals, you kind of rush to fill and dot the I's. And so I knew I loved timber. I knew I had an interest of it. And so we kind of rushed to put together a proposal to do a timber exhibition. And when we designed the exhibition, it was, I guess, proposed to be something, I think, a more traditional architectural exhibition, one where there would be architectural models, you'd look at the beauty of timber, something that we've all seen before. But as I started doing more research, we discovered that in Europe there was a surge of this new type of timber technology called cross-laminated timber, which is obviously the picture of the wood. We were entranced by this material because it allowed for new possibilities that weren't possible before in timber construction. But what I think what really struck us was that, you know, there was all these articles about climate change and rising water. And as we did our research, these kind of statistics came to the forefront. I showed this slide earlier this afternoon, but it was interesting that every year that I present this slide, the year keeps on changing, but the statistics is the same. But the statistic in the center, I think, is the largest kind of impact that we came away with when we were doing research for that exhibition. The fact that the construction, the operation of buildings makes such a large impact to the elements on the slide before, it made us realize that we should do something. The architects have a responsibility to change how we build our buildings since they make such a large impact. And so I was a small firm and still am. And so how can a small firm make an impact? When you want to have grand gestures, you have large aspirations, but as a kind of singular entity, how do you do something and make sure that what you're doing has a point and that has meaning and people will care? So we designed this exhibition. It really talked about this environmental and sustainable aspects of timber construction, which now you can find really on the web. But what I was most proud about was that we designed this competition where 4 young designers or design teams would compete to build timber structures. And we designed it because first we kind of hated kind of architectural competitions in general, because often the case is you win the commission, then you have to figure out how to pay to build it. And so that was something that we did not want to have young designers burdened with. So even before we launched the competitions, we made agreements with 4 different manufacturers that said that no matter what the students proposed, they would build it, regardless of the cost. And that was a difficult thing to negotiate with, just being a few people. So what we did was, with this in hand, what we had an idea was that, can you provide an opportunity for young designers to build a actual structure that was, I guess, portfolio worthy, so that they could use that to build more timber structures. And so the idea is to promote and advocate for more timber buildings or timber structures, because timber buildings have a beneficial impact to the environment. And so what we did was, when the students won the award, we paired them with an architect and an engineer and the material fabricator to have 6 months to develop the project instead of having to build it immediately, and learn from that process, learn through the design development and the construction document and the fabrication, so that they could learn through the process, gain knowledge about timber, which is often lacking in schools, and also have an example of timber construction in their portfolio, which would later lead to other jobs. And so a number of these have done so. The one here in the upper right is from a firm called Ultramodern, who won the Chicago Biennale Pavilion the first year. They never knew about cross-laminate timber before. And they structure their practice around timber construction now because of this. So in many ways, the carbon footprint of this exhibition has been more and more negative every year we go forward. So this idea of, can design have a meaningful impact? And we tried to do that in this exhibition in Boston. But 2 years later, someone from the National Building Museum in DC caught wind of the exhibition in Boston and asked us to redo it at their museum in DC. And that really excited us, because we had designed the exhibition in Boston to speak to a larger group beside just architects, to the general public, because of talking about architecture impacting climate change. But we realized that we couldn't make significant change because it was policymakers that make this change. So we decided to agree to do the exhibition because they wanted us to basically revamp everything. But with the opportunity to engage policymakers and industrial leaders to then create a narrative so that people could understand what the benefits of timber construction could be, so that it could change policy, seemed like an incredible opportunity that a small firm could not ignore, especially if our desire is to make impactful change through design. So you can see here, we use basically the Timber City exhibition as a way to marry all these entities that usually are separate, to create this to be a kind of precedent so that it could convince people and have people understand what the benefits of timber construction could be. So really the National Building Museum is an odd space because it has a huge atrium. And so we really took that advantage of that, so that the material could be both material sample, wayfinding, signage, mock-up, and so it acted simultaneously as one. At the museum, what they wanted to do was create, I think, built installations similar to what we had before at the Boston, but we decided we wanted the material to take center stage. And so rather than building installations, we really wanted to have the material highlighted. And so a lot of the idea came from just this simple image. And in many ways, a lot of our design is sourced in this kind of idea where we only tell half of a story and we want the viewer to complete the story. So in this, we have material staged, leaning against a wall. We don't know if it's about to fall or be erected. And so that it's the viewer who then imagines the potential of what the material could be, rather than having a wall section or something like that, that's too concrete. And so we want to have people use their imagination to solve the story. And so we use that kind of design thinking where things are both casual and very refined. They flutter between the two to hopefully to have our work have a dialogue with the viewer. So this is another view. You can see we have kind of information about timber construction where you see the material behind. It acts as, again, material sample, exhibition wall, mock-up. And so we really kind of designed the project so that it would be separated from the masonry construction, really highlighting the difference between masonry and CLT. And so we have this kind of layout and views like this. So it was really exciting to have this opportunity because after the exhibition opened, we learned that many senators and senator aides would come through the exhibition to learn about the material. And then about 6 months ago, there was a new Timber Innovation Act that was a bipartisan bill introduced in the Senate. And the Forest Service and the South Lumber Board feel that the way that they were able to get it through was supported by this exhibition itself, because people could see physical representation of what was in a paper. This is another project that really led to the development of the conversation plinth. It's called Outside In. It's our attempt to develop a material. And so we were using timber waste, which we did in the conversation plinth as well. And what we tried to do was make basically a timber version of CMU, because we realized that there was a panel version of timber, a stick version, but not a block. And so basically this is a construction of timber log cutoffs that are rotated inwards to make a modular system. The idea of the overall project was really a play on the tree bench, where usually a tree bench, you sit and the tree is behind you. And this idea was not only with the material a reversal, but the tree, the kind of design was also a reversal of the tree bench, where you're looking at the material that the piece was built from. So this is the idea of timber waste modular unit. It's taking the cutoffs that usually are left and discarded when scoring up a log, rotating them, and then facing them inward, trying to minimize the amount of energy needed to create this product. We were looking at the life cycle, which we did in kind of theory in the exhibition, but we tried to use it in practice. When we were doing the life cycle in the exhibition, we understood that there were many benefits over steel and concrete, but we found areas of inefficiency. And so a lot of it had to do with the processing and what waste was left over and how they utilize that waste. And so our idea was to then take these large pieces of timber, which represented, I think, about 35% or 40% of the log, and then utilize that to make another timber product rather than just chipping it and going to mulch. Really, the idea of timber construction, for those who weren't here this afternoon, is the idea is that trees have this incredible ability to remove carbon from the atmosphere and lock it into the fiber of their material. And so once you harvest a tree, that material gets locked in the building product. And so it's basically removing carbon, which affects climate change, and then locking in this building product so that it's no longer in the atmosphere. And so the more material that we prevent from being burned or decayed and locked into actual permanent structures is a benefit to us all. So for this project, we did all the fabrication. We tried to understand the material by using it one-on-one. We often rent space at a shop, and so again, with my background in sculpture, I really love working with my hands, and so we try to understand the limitations of material. We found a module that worked because the log cutouts are not completely square, but we went as far as applying for a patent, which we got, and we tried to mass produce this material. But what we didn't realize, what we didn't understand, and what we applied for the Conversation Plinth project was not understanding all the regulations and rules involved in bringing a product to market, understanding how industry works and all the systems in place. So it was an incredible eye-opener in terms of, you can design something, but to implement it at a impactful scale, you have to understand the systems and the hurdles involved. And so we tried to do that for the Conversation Plinth. We did this kind of exhaustive study where we also were interested in how materials weather over time. And so in these materials, we tried different types of finishes. We tried different type of notches to release tension in the wood to understand how best you could utilize wood in an exterior application. Because in many ways, timber doesn't work well in exterior locations unless detailed correctly. And it's one of the limitations of CLT, which if some of you have recently been to the Conversation Plinth have seen. And so we are trying to learn from this, and we're trying to develop a new panel that can work in an exterior application, learning from how the material moved in Columbus. So here are people happy looking at the material. So this is the Conversation Plinth. I guess some of you been. Who's been? Can you raise your hand? All right, good. So I'll walk a little bit about some of the ideas behind the development of the idea and give you maybe a little of the Wizard of Oz experience of understanding the design process. So we felt incredibly fortunate to be part of the 10 finalists invited. And in many ways, we didn't really understand why, because we were really an unknown firm. We did a few interesting things, but I wouldn't say necessarily to the caliber of many of our colleagues. But we thought it was an incredible opportunity, so we wanted to do something special. But it's hard to do something special when you're visiting a place like Columbus. So when I visited the site, this is, for those who are not familiar, it is, I would say, the most prominent site, maybe the best site, and the most difficult site. It's surrounded by these kind of great works, these great architects and artists. And so how do you put something in there that doesn't compete, but has a dialogue with the other structures? And I struggled in trying to figure this out. There was a very, lots of long nights, and we didn't know what we were going to do. But what we did recognize is that they were formally quite different, but what connected them were these plinths that supported them. And for those who don't know, the plinths are basically pedestals that are supporting the buildings that signify their importance. And so that was something that we thought was in common. But what I realized when I kept on walking around Columbus is that after the first or second day, I became not very interested in looking at the architecture anymore, probably because I'm a bad architect. But I was more interested in talking to the people there, listening to what they had to say. And I came to realize that there was something unexplainable about Columbus that you could see through the eyes of the people there. And I didn't know how to quantify that. And Tomomi and I, we debated and struggled, how do you formalize something as special as this? So we realized that we wanted to do something for the people of Columbus. And we tried to create this analogous relationship between the pedestals and the plinths of the buildings. While the buildings got all the acclaim, but it was the pedestals that supported them. And we tried to find this relationship that it was the people of Columbus who should get the acclaim and not the buildings, because it was the people that were the resultant but also supported the life and activity of the building. So this is what we tried to do, was create an installation or a monument for the people. This took a while to get to. And so I remember looking at this piece. And you can see the pedestals in the forefront where there's art objects on top. But you can see in the background, the pedestal and the supposedly sculpture are one and the same. And in many ways, that was our aspiration, is to make a sculpture of plinths, a monument of support. And that was much of the idea behind the plinth. We also were in love with the Miller house and the conversation plinth, the pit. And when I went there the first time, I was able to go in the pit. But when Tomomi came, she wasn't able to go in. And we thought that was really sad, is that even though the Miller house was open to the public, there was still this area of privacy in the house. And so as an homage to Miller and to try to give something to the people of Columbus, we wanted to bring the conversation pit out and into the kind of public square to make this almost outdoor living room in the plaza, which we felt was not working well at the time. So we have this idea of these two elements, the conversation pit and the plinth, to make this idea of this conversation plinth where people could walk up and no longer be looking up at the buildings, but be at the same eye level of the buildings. And so we developed this kind of graphic where people were looking from below, looking up at the moor, at the Pei, at the Saarinen, in awe of these buildings because people have told them that they're important. But what we wanted to do was elevate them so that you would walk up there and you would see eye to eye with them, so that there would be a new kind of equal playing field. And so I forget when the symposium happened. When was that? No, it was in like October, September. And so we were supposed to design something, and we had a presentation in December. And we didn't know what we were doing. And I remember we were developing a completely different scheme. And then I remember going home for Thanksgiving and really kind of depressed because I didn't know what we were going to do. And I remember there was a moment where I was sitting at the dining table, and you have to remember my father's an architect, and he was asking, "Oh, how's it going?" And it made me have a flashback to when I was a child at Thanksgiving dinner. And you finally are able to sit at the adult table, but the adults are talking, and you want to be part of that conversation, but you can't. That's what it clicked. That's because that's what I felt. I imagined what it must be like in Columbus for the people in Columbus, is that everyone's coming to see the architecture, and then they leave. But the people of Columbus should be part of that conversation. So how can we make an installation that can allow that to happen? And so that's what was the idea of this idea of making a monument for the people and elevating them up so that they could be on this kind of equal kind of playing field. So that was at Thanksgiving, and so we only had a few weeks. So we were developing this scheme, a completely different one. And then when I came back from Thanksgiving, I knew this wasn't right, but we had to present something. So we were just keep on going. And I remember in the archives seeing this picture of them putting this frame in for the moor. And we were trying to play around with this, but it wasn't right. And then I remember going back to the beginning. And this was a model I quickly made on the first few days when I came back from Columbus, and we generated this, and this is basically the kind of concept model that led us to the conversation plinth. After I left Columbus, I developed these kind of sketches of things that I wanted to try and do with the project. And it was hard to marry those things, but we were able to try to achieve it through the project itself. I remember during the presentation, I've been on some juries before, and often a presentation is affected dramatically by preceding presentations, what they say or don't say. And we were third, but people were talking about, we were fourth. People were talking about this area because the Sheridan Church site was the first presentation. And every architect talked about how perfect everything was. And we didn't feel that it was perfect. We thought that the site was broken. And so we realized, though, if we didn't know if this would be something that the jury would like, because everyone was talking how wonderful the buildings were, how plaza was, so it was a risk. But we felt that the site was broken because eventually bollards, which you can see with that big kind of red minus sign, bollards were introduced so the rotaries couldn't be used anymore as Pei intended. So really the function of the site, the intended functions of the site was lost. How people circulated through the site was no longer used as it was intended, so it was a broken site. So we tried to use the installation to kind of merge a site and restore the original circulation, albeit pedestrian rather than vehicular, to kind of site the project. The other part of our aspiration of the project was that we were in awe about Columbus in general, like every architect is that Miller was able to bring design to Columbus, and he did so through Cummings, which was industry, and so through industry he brought design. And so we wanted to reciprocate and show not only to ourselves, because we wanted to demonstrate design can have an impact, but also show to the people of Columbus, especially those in Columbus who don't appreciate Miller and what he did, that design does have a place and can make an impact. And so through this project, we tried to propose something where design could bring industry. In our research, what we realized was that the largest cash crop was hardwood, and what was the most surprising thing was that more than 50% of the log went to industrial materials, to low-grade materials. Now that seemed like a crazy percentage. It went to these pallets and cans. And so what we decided to do was to upcycle that material to create hardwood CLT that did not exist in the United States. We learned from our mistakes in the Outside In project, where we immediately partnered with one of the 2 certified manufacturers, the CLT in the United States, because our goal was to bring it to certification, full market certification. And there's this process called PRG through 20, which is an APA certification testing approach. And we didn't want to fall into the same trap of what we did in the Outside In and the TWMU project. We felt a little bit when we did that TWMU project, it was almost playing with material. And until we could bring it to be used at an industrial level, to us it would still be playing. And so right now we're in the process of achieving PR320 with the hardwood CLT that we first developed in the conversation plinth. So we wanted to use this project as a demonstration project to prove to the hardwood industry that hardwood should be a building material, because for so long it lost its place. But historically it was one of the original structural materials to build structures here in the United States. And then hopefully the resultant is jobs, increased land value, and then money in the pocket of rural economies, and also the environmental impact. We found that through the National Building Exhibition that this environmental impact message did not speak to everyone. And so that was just icing on the cake. If we could prove the other things, that would be the main instigator, and then the sustainable aspect would just follow along. So why hardwood CLT? Because right now, if some of you may know that for the last 25 years there has been softwood CLT, and then in the last maybe 5 years here in the United States it's really made a big push to build timber structures. And there's timber structures now on the West Coast, growing rapidly in Canada. So it's really a question of why do you have to develop another material? And so not only were we utilizing this unused resource of low-grade hardwood to try and diversify the market and allow mills to have options to sell their material, but hardwood has superior mechanical properties so that potentially it can create a structural superior panel with less volume to then negate the fact that hardwood weighs more. It also, in our kind of testing, shows that it can achieve a 2-hour rating with a thinner assembly. And so many times softwood CLT is sized to be able to achieve that 2-hour rating, even though it already meets the structural capacity at a thinner kind of a layup. But to achieve the 2-hour rating, if they want to leave the CLT exposed, you have to make it a certain depth. So hardwood, because of its increased fire resistance, will allow for that. And finally, I guess the other benefit is that often in many softwood CLT buildings, they put a topping slab on top because it's just not as durable as a walking surface. And just as in the conversation plinth or in hopefully subsequent projects, it could be a true structural finished floor where the material that's providing structural rigidity also is the finished material that you're walking on. So we did the proposal. It went, I guess, well. So we started trying to test material. And so we did it really from sourcing it from log and understanding each of the steps, because our partner only worked within the softwood industry, and they were not familiar with the hardwood industry. And so the subtle differences and the big differences between the two were remarkable as we started learning. There's a totally different culture between the two. How they break down the log is different. And so that was part of trying to figure out how to make this happen, because many of the people didn't feel didn't believe that it could happen. They didn't understand why we would want to do it. So we really had to ask a lot of questions to understand the systems. So we developed both this hardwood and hybrid hardwood with softwood core possibilities. So we're trying to, on the upper slides, we're trying to marry hardwood on the face and then weaker softwood in the core, and then all hardwood panel below, which the conversation has both of. We started looking more in depth about the project. I think there was a period of time where we didn't know if we won or not, and so we were always like wondering, did we do the right thing? And so always in the back of my mind, I was worried that it seemed a little illogical to take square panels and then cut them round again when they came from a round thing. But we kept on searching and searching for meaning. We found these incredible photos. Mass timber originally was round. And this kind of occupiable kind of log structure, which you can see in the middle, is a very wonderful precedent from nature, because as a tree grows, they kind of abandon the core because the outer rings become the structural element. And so constantly we were searching for more inspiration, often from nature, because we always say Mother Nature is the best designer. So if you don't screw it up, you can do something. So we try to develop these kind of constantly searching for more sources of inspiration. So I put this slide together because at the beginning I mentioned how many stars had to align to make the project happen. And there was more chance that it could not happen than it did. In some ways, we were incredibly fortunate to have it be in Columbus. When we proposed the project, we said we were going to apply for this U.S. Forest Service grant. And it's easy to propose that, and then we were told we would won, and we had to submit for the grant. And I don't know if anyone has submitted for a governmental grant, but it's not fun. And so it was the first time I ever did that, and so we tried to apply. And so we submitted it after a lot of help, and then we were waiting. Because it was clear from the pricing exercises that we could not afford it with the budget allotted, that we needed additional funds, and that was where the Forest Service had to come in. So we were developing options, and we had to develop two simultaneously because we knew we would run out of time because the timeline didn't work well. It worked okay, but it didn't work perfectly. And then you can see there was the original date of the U.S. Forest Service announcement, and that was delayed. And it mostly was because of the election. There was a transition, and no one knew what was happening. No one knew where funds were coming. If funds were happening, we heard that EPA funds were closing, so we had a belief that we wouldn't get the funds. So we were still developing two options because we didn't want to do kind of a bait and switch with Columbus. So we decided we have to start developing the material. So you can see the material shipped in to SmartLand for panel testing. You can see the red asterisks. They immediately told us that their machines couldn't handle processing the hardwood. And so we didn't know what to do. So then we had to develop a workaround where material would be processed at the hardwood facilities and then shipped rapidly to the softwood places so that they could be pressed. So one thing solved, but still no funds. Then we were informed informally that maybe you're going to get the funds in late May, and we knew we were in a jam. So we had to proceed at risk. And so we were developing the project, and we thought there might be a decent chance we would get the funds. But we had another problem is that we potentially had funds, but no hardwood manufacturer was willing to shift their production schedule to give us material because they still could make more money exporting their kind of material to China or some other country. And so we were scrambling around to try and find a partner until we engaged the National Hardwood Lumber Association, who helped us then introduce us to certain people within the field. Then we got formal notice that we got the award, but we still didn't know if the funds were going to come. So we kept on pushing the development. The material started getting processed and shipped to Columbus, but we received word from SmartLand while they were processing the materials that they spoke to their insurance company, and the insurance company wouldn't let them do the construction. And that was at the end of July. So then we had to find a contractor because construction was supposed to happen in August, which was a week and a half away, a contractor to help us build it. So we had to do construction drawings because we were going to do everything digitally with SmartLand. And we did construction drawings in about 3 days, and we met with a construction outfit in Columbus to help us build it. And then we started building it in Columbus, and then suddenly on the last day of the opening, it was all completed. But you can see there's this rapid kind of process where if certain things didn't align, we would have been in a lot of trouble. So these are kind of the two extremes. We knew we didn't want to shrink the scale, but if we didn't get the award, we would have to thin out the panels considerably, almost the plywood thinness. And so those who've been to the project know that the panels are about 3.5 inch thick. We would have, if we had not received the grant, we would have thinned it out, only making the walking surface CLT. And so we went as far as changing the way that things were cut so that everything was nested. SmartLamp said they could never build this because there was too many pieces, so we would have had to build it ourselves. But we developed this option fully so that if we didn't get the grant, we would build this. But as luck would have it, we finally got the grant eventually. And so this is kind of an example of how layups were determined and how we distributed material per different units and how they were nested. So we had to find a balance between having massive panels that they could swing in so that because the schedule was so tight, but also trying to limit the amount of material and panels made, because you have to remember that the material was sourced in Indiana, but it had to go 2,000 miles to Montana. And hardwood weighs a lot, and so we had to pay for each truck that went, and there's a weight limitation for each truck. So this is kind of the example of the process. So, we harvested in Indiana. We found that single mills could not process it enough material for us. So then we went to a processor that the mills then sent the material to so that everything could be processed at a uniform manner. The thing about one of the main differences between hardwood and softwood is that when they break down the log, hardwood is cut at uneven widths. And so, whereas in softwood, everything is dimensional. And so it's critical for it to be dimensional when you make softwood CLT. So we had to find a way to process hardwood as if it was dimensional lumber. Not only that, we were using grade 3 common mixed species ash, maple, oak, and hickory. That was typically green, and so we had to apply first grade application by surfacing on 4 sides and drying it to a certain moisture content so that it could be glued up as if it was softwood CLT, just hardwood material. So we had to apply all these different processes to create the product. So what we ended up was we developed 2 different widths, and usually CLT is made of a single dimensional lumber. But because wood is the hardwood was at different widths, we found a kind of sweet spot between wide boards and thin boards. And so through the panels, we have alternating layers between wider boards and thin boards so that we could maximize the yield of the material that we bought and processed from the Indiana mills. That material then was transported to Montana. But as I mentioned before, the softwood machines couldn't handle the hardwood. So we had 10 days to process the material and surface it in Indiana before it was shipped to Montana, because after 10 days, part of the processing is planing the face of the surface. And after 10 days, the pores of the fiber start closing, and there wouldn't be enough glue adhesion. And so it had to be rapidly shipped and then immediately off the truck and pressed immediately. Then it was smooth sailing from there, and then it was cut and then shipped back to Indiana. So here are some pictures. So these are 40-foot lambs that are finger jointed together, inserted into the press. And so this is the first hardwood CLT pressing. It keeps on going, so I'll keep on going. So that's 40 feet long and 10 feet wide. I think for a small firm to be working with a certified manufacturer to develop a new material just talks about how new and uncharted the boundaries of timber construction are. If this was a more established process or the regulations were more clear, a small firm would not have that possibility. I mean, even for the U.S. Forest Service grant, we were the only architecture firm, I believe, that has ever won that grant. And so it was a unusual circumstance because we were encouraged to apply because of how we met people at the National Building Museum exhibition. But that paired with the opportunity to be in Columbus, it was this perfect kind of moons aligning where we had a palette and we had this kind of connection that we probably shouldn't have had, and we tried to take advantage of it to develop this material. So here's some images of the first CNC of the conversation plinth, of a all hardwood kind of lamb. The thing is that the picture on the left, the left, is one of the slabs that you walk on when you are in the plinth. And when they started pressing it, they realized that it was about 1/16 too thin, the lambs. And so our engineer had to recalc it, and they had to add extra lamb to it during the pressing because it wasn't thick enough. I'll show you why in a little bit why that's important. This is a CNC that can take a 40-foot by 10-foot panel, which is pretty remarkable. And these are some of the installation shots. And so the contractor, they never used this material before. They knew that I was desperate because we were out of time, but they worked fairly with me, which I think speaks to the generosity of Columbus. But they estimated 2 weeks. And I would say they beat that by a week. The only reason it took them a little longer is because they started installing things a little incorrectly. But the material was so easy for them to work with. I've never gotten a bill from a contractor that's less than their estimate. So that was pretty amazing. So here's some more images. So you can see the hardwood slab that's supported by the columns. And that is on top of the steel columns is the kind of 100% hardwood cross-section. And so we worked with the engineer to develop and size all the engineered all the panels. And since the panels were mixed species, he had to engineer the panel for the weakest species. The idea to use a mixed species blend, because most CLT is really a single source, is that we understood that wood is a commodity, and we didn't want our panel to be subject to constant market fluctuations. So really the idea is whatever wood is the cheapest within the range of a similar E modulus, they can make the panel out of that and create that panel to be a structural panel. So in some panels will be oversized, but some will be just right there. And so in this case, we needed to use hardwood CLT at the top of the columns because if we use softwood, the columns would have shear punched through the slab. So you can see here, you can see the moments of stress. If it wasn't hardwood, the columns would just either punch right through, or we would have to make the capitals on the columns much larger, which we didn't want to do. So it demonstrated what could be some potential of what CLT can do, and as a kind of demonstration project itself. Here's some more images for those who haven't been. We tried to make this lantern for the plaza because when we would go there, it was always empty at night. And we thought that it was so sad that a plaza would be unoccupied. And I think there was just a huge amount of self-satisfaction. I remember on opening night when people would be gathering, and I heard that people go there often in the evening. And so it's something that you hope for. You never know if people are going to react or interact with a piece. But the people of Columbus seem to. I mean, in our practice, we do a lot of fine art work in museums and galleries. And we always joke that only in Columbus could you build something this close to a Moore sculpture without protecting it. Because in any other place, you would blow the entire budget by just protecting the Moore. Here are a few more shots of the evening. So you can see here, this is, I don't know if you can read it, but it's the equivalent of removing the carbon emission of 17 cars annually, the amount of material that we used in this project. And so you can just imagine in a building scale how much kind of carbon can be sequestered in the fiber. This is a time lapse of the construction. Our hope was that people from the hardwood industry would come see this project and be convinced that hardwood had a place in building products. Because it was interesting, every time I would speak to people within that industry, they only saw the material to be meant for finish. And they didn't believe it. And so our hope, even with this kind of smaller structures, that it could convince them that there was a place that, why not? And so it's exciting to say is that I've been working with the National Hardwood Lumber Association, and now because of this project, I spoke at their national convention, and they're going to start pouring money into the development of hardwood CLT now because they've seen it in action. They're excited about the possibility of re-entering the building products market. They're excited about the possibility of working with the softwood industry, which for hundreds of years they've been so separate, to create this new panel that we are going to develop with them in SmartLand. So learning from some of the failures from the Conversation Plinth project itself in terms of how the material is weathering, we're developing two different avenues. We're developing one that's a hybrid material that just is focused on lighter weight, but structure superior, hitting all those various points of increased fire resistance, superior mechanical properties. But we're also adding to our plate an exterior rated CLT panel because CLT isn't typically used outside. So we're using thermally modified lumber to create the assemblies, and then we're using other processes that make the wood more dimensionally stable to create the project, create the panel, for the next phase of what we can do to make a larger impact in their industry, and also hopefully to create a new hardwood industry here in Indiana. So that's it. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, not. Okay. Well, thank you very much.